You never fully understand how fragile your life is until one small moment tips everything over. What was meant to be a simple family trip, a peaceful retreat to the mountains for some reconnection, was something Thomas insisted on. He always cared about appearances, wanting to present us as a perfect, unified family, never fully accepting me as his stepmother. I agreed to the trip more out of habit than anything else. It was what I did agree, comply, keep the peace. But peace wasn't what I found that weekend. Make sure to subscribe to my channel so I can continue bringing you more fascinating true stories like this one. And don't forget to watch this video till the end and like the video because this story is going to be incredibly interesting. Please hit the like button to show your support. It started with a simple mistake, a mix-up with the lodge reservations. Thomas had booked the wrong dates for our rooms, leaving us one short. He dismissed it casually, suggesting that Ethan and I share a room. "It's just for one night," he had said, waving it off. That night, as I lay next to Ethan in the dim light of our shared room, I realized how fragile the family dynamic we had built really was. Looking back, I wonder if it was inevitable, if everything was bound to fall apart eventually, or if it was that one night at the lodge that triggered everything. Whatever it was, the consequences rippled much further than I could have imagined. This is the story of how everything fell apart. The drive to the lodge was long and quiet, the kind of silence that only comes when people don't have much left to say. Thomas was driving, focused on the road ahead, while I sat beside him, staring out the window. Ethan was in the back, his headphones in, eyes fixed on his phone. It wasn't unfamiliar. Our family trips had always felt like this, three people moving separately, never truly connecting. "Did you bring the hiking boots?" Thomas asked, breaking the silence. "Yes," I answered flatly. He nodded, his attention already on the road again. Ethan barely spoke during the drive. He rarely did, especially around me. At 28, he had the quiet, intense demeanor that made you feel like he was always hiding something. He had his mother's dark hair and sharp features, constant reminders of the woman Thomas had loved before me. I didn't resent Ethan for it. His mother had died when he was just a teenager, leaving a gap that no one, not even Thomas, could fill. Still, there was distance between us, one neither of us had made much of an effort to bridge. When we reached the lodge, the sun was setting, casting the mountains in golden light. The lodge was quaint, rustic but charming, reminding us of past family vacations. Thomas checked us in while Ethan and I unloaded the car. "This place is nice." The lodge was warm and inviting, with wooden panels and cozy furniture. But when Thomas returned from the front desk, his expression told me something was wrong. "There's been a mix-up," he said, rubbing his hair in frustration. "They only have 2 rooms available tonight. The third one won't be ready until tomorrow." I looked at him, realizing what this meant. "So what now?" "We'll figure it out," he said briskly. "I'll take 1 room, and you and Ethan can share the other." I felt a knot form in my stomach, but didn't argue. Thomas had already moved on from the issue, dismissing it as an inconvenience. The room Ethan and I shared was small, cozy, with a queen-sized bed and a warm lamp casting a gentle glow over the quilt. The scent of pine drifted in through the open window. "This is cozy," Ethan said, his tone neutral, as he set down his bag. I forced a smile. "It's just for one night." The awkwardness was immediate. I tried to distract myself by unpacking, putting my things away in the small bathroom, while Ethan fiddled with his phone. As the night came, the tension in the room was thick. "You take the bed," Ethan said, standing by the window. "I can sleep on the floor." "Don't be ridiculous," I replied, shaking my head. "The bed's big enough for both of us." He hesitated before nodding. I lay on one side of the bed, staring at the ceiling. Ethan lay beside me, breathing softly. I tried to convince myself it was fine, that nothing would happen, but deep down, I knew better. That night, everything started to feel different. The room settled into a quiet calm, and the sound of crickets echoed outside. The soft light from the lamp cast shadows on the walls, creating a dreamlike atmosphere. Ethan was on one side of the bed, scrolling through his phone, while I pretended to read a book, but my mind wasn't in it. Dinner had been quiet. Like most of our meals together, Thomas talked about work, recounting stories while Ethan and I nodded along. Neither of us was really present. I couldn't pinpoint when the tension started, but maybe it had always been there, an underlying current that I had ignored for years. Now it was impossible to overlook. "You're not really reading that, are you?" Ethan asked suddenly, breaking the silence. "What makes you say that?" I asked, trying to sound casual. He smirked, setting his phone down. "You've been on the same page for the last 20 minutes. I laughed softly. Embarrassed, "You got me." Ethan shifted, and something about his body language felt more relaxed than I was used to. "What's on your mind?" I wasn't expecting the question. "Nothing," I said quickly. He raised an eyebrow, clearly unconvinced. "Come on, Margaret. I know you better than that." The way he said my name made my heart skip a beat. It wasn't the usual stepmom or silence. It felt ... different. I sighed, leaning back against the headboard. "I guess I'm just thinking about how things used to be. Family trips used to be fun." Writer Ethan nodded, his face softening. "Yeah, they were, back when it was just me and Dad, before I realized how fake everything was." His words hit hard, but not because he was wrong. "I've tried," I said quietly, "to make this work, to be someone you and your dad could count on." "I know," he said gently, "and I appreciate it, even if I don't always say it." For the first time, it felt like the walls between us were coming down. We talked for hours, sharing frustrations about Thomas, recalling trips Ethan had taken with his mother. "She was the glue," Ethan said, his voice filled with nostalgia. "Dad always worked, but Mom made everything feel complete." I nodded, my heart heavy. It's hard to live up to someone like that. "You don't have to," he said simply. We fell into a comfortable silence. I turned off the lamp, leaving the moonlight to spill into the room. My leg brushed against his. "Sorry," I murmured, quickly pulling away. "It's fine," he said, his voice low and calm, but the moment felt different. Every small movement he made seemed to amplify it, reminding me how close we were. "Are you okay?" Ethan asked softly, breaking the silence. "Ethan," I whispered, "do you ever feel like you're pretending?" He asked suddenly, his tone raw. "Living a life that's not really yours, doing everything you're supposed to, but never feeling real." His words struck a chord deep inside me. Every day, I admitted it. The words hung between us, raw and honest. And then it happened. It wasn't dramatic or planned. One moment we were talking in hushed voices. The next, his hand brushed mine, and neither of us pulled away. "Is this okay?" he whispered. I should have said no. I should have gotten up, left the room, but instead, I turned toward him, my heart racing. "Yes," I whispered. When it was over, we lay in silence. My mind was a whirlwind of confusion and guilt, but I couldn't bring myself to speak. "I'm sorry," Ethan said, his voice breaking the stillness. "Don't apologize," I replied quickly, my voice trembling. "It's fine. I don't know what this means." He admitted. "Neither do I," I whispered. But deep down, I knew what it meant. The next morning, I woke before Ethan, slipping out of bed as quietly as I could. The soft light of dawn filtered through the curtains, casting a warm golden hue across the room. I dressed quickly, avoiding the mirror, and by the time Ethan stirred, I was sitting by the window, pretending to be absorbed in the view of the mountains. "Morning," he mumbled, his voice thick with sleep. "Morning," I replied, keeping my tone neutral. For a moment, he hesitated, as if he wanted to say more, but he simply nodded and went into the bathroom without another word. When we met Thomas in the dining room for breakfast, The tension between Ethan and me was palpable. Thomas, blissfully unaware, sipped his coffee and read the newspaper, occasionally commenting on the weather or our plans for the day. But I could feel Ethan's gaze on me, heavy and searching, and it took all my willpower not to meet his eyes. I told myself that the tension would ease, that the memory of the night before would fade, and we'd return to normal. But as the day wore on, I began to understand that some things, once done, could never be undone. The drive back from the lodge was quiet. It wasn't the peaceful silence I had hoped for, but one filled with an uncomfortable weight, as though every unspoken word and thought was pressing in on us. Thomas, still oblivious to everything, hummed and tapped his fingers on the steering wheel as he navigated the winding mountain roads. Ethan sat in the back seat, looking out the window while I stared ahead, my hands tightly folded in my lap. I tried to focus on the scenery outside the rolling hills, the forests, the golden light filtering through the trees, but my thoughts kept circling back to the previous night. Every detail was burned into my memory. Ethan's breathing, the way his hand had brushed mine. It felt unreal, like a dream, and yet the consequences of it all were clear and unavoidably present. I risked a glance at Ethan in the rearview mirror. He looked calm, almost indifferent. But I noticed the tension in his jaw and how his fingers gripped the armrest a little too tightly. We were both avoiding each other's gaze, and I didn't know if that was a relief or a punishment. When we finally pulled into the driveway, Thomas stretched, already making plans for the rest of the day. "I've got a meeting in a couple of hours," he announced, "but we should do something tonight, maybe dinner at that new Italian place." "Sure," I replied automatically, though the thought of a family dinner made my stomach churn. Ethan didn't say anything. He grabbed his bag from the trunk and walked into the house without a word. The rest of the afternoon was spent doing chores. I folded laundry, cleaned the kitchen, and reorganized the bookshelf in the living room, anything to keep myself busy and distracted. But no matter how hard I tried, my thoughts kept drifting back to Ethan. I replayed our conversation from the night before, the way he had talked about feeling lost, about pretending to be someone he wasn't. I remembered the quiet understanding in his eyes, the kind I hadn't felt from anyone in years, certainly not from Thomas. The sound of footsteps on the stairs interrupted my thoughts. I looked up to see Ethan standing in the doorway, his hands shoved into the pockets of his jeans. "Hey," he said awkwardly. "Hey," I replied, my voice coming out more strained than I had intended. For a moment, neither of us spoke, and even though the contact was brief, it left me feeling breathless. I busied myself with tidying the counter while he rummaged through the fridge, trying to ignore the way my heart raced whenever he moved. "Last night," he began, his voice hesitant. I froze, my fingers tightening around the dish towel. "We don't have to talk about it," I said quickly. "Yes, we do," he insisted, closing the fridge door and turning to face me. "We can't just pretend like it didn't happen." "Why not?" I asked, my voice sharper than I meant. "That's exactly what we need to do, pretend it didn't happen and move on." He stared at me for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "Is that what you really want?" "What I want doesn't matter," I replied, my voice trembling. "This, whatever this is, it can't happen again." "Why not?" he demanded. "Because it's wrong, because it's inconvenient, or because you're scared." "Stop it," I snapped, turning away from him. He took a step closer, his voice softer now. "You don't have to keep pretending, Margaret, not with me." "Please, Ethan," I whispered, my chest tight. For a moment, I thought he might argue or push me further, but instead, he sighed and stepped back, running a hand through his hair. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I didn't mean to make this harder for you." "It's already hard," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. He nodded, his gaze lingering on me for a moment before he turned and left the room. That evening, Thomas was in his usual cheerful mood, chatting about work and plans for the future. Ethan and I both played along, nodding and smiling at the right moments, but the tension was unbearable. At one point, Thomas turned to Ethan, his expression curious. "You've been quiet today. Everything okay?" "Yeah," Ethan replied quickly, forcing a smile. "Just tired from the trip." Thomas nodded, seemingly satisfied with the answer, and continued with his meal. But I could feel Ethan's gaze on me, heavy and searching, and it took all my willpower not to meet his eyes. Later that night, after Thomas had gone to bed, I found myself pacing the living room, my mind racing. I couldn't keep pretending everything was fine when it clearly wasn't. I was so absorbed in my thoughts that I didn't hear Ethan come down the stairs until he spoke. "Can't sleep?" he asked, his voice low. I turned to see him standing in the doorway, his expression cautious. "No," I admitted, barely above a whisper. He stepped into the room, his hands shoved into his pockets. Me neither. We stood there in silence for a long moment, the unspoken tension growing heavier with each passing second. "I don't know what to do," I said finally, my voice trembling. "Neither do I," he admitted, his gaze dropping to the floor. "But I know I don't want to lose you." His words hit me like a blow, and I felt my chest tighten. "Ethan, we can, I know," he said quickly, his voice pained. "But that doesn't mean I can just forget about you." I shook my head, tears stinging my eyes. "This isn't fair to any of us." "I know," he repeated, his voice breaking. "I just ... I needed to hear you say it." For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he stood up, running a hand through his hair. "I'm going to go for a walk," he said, his voice barely audible. "Be careful." I whispered, though the words fell hollow. He nodded, and then he was gone, leaving me with my thoughts. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling as Thomas slept soundly beside me. I felt trapped, as if the cage of my own making had closed around me, and I couldn't escape. The next morning, Ethan was gone. I found the note on the kitchen counter, written in his messy handwriting. "I need some time to clear my head. Don't worry about me. I'll be fine. I just need to figure things out on my own." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I clutched the note, my hands trembling as panic rose in my chest. "What's that?" Thomas asked, walking into the kitchen with his phone in hand. "Ethan left," I said, my voice shaking. Thomas frowned, taking the note from me. "What the hell does that mean? Where did he go?" "I don't know," I admitted, tears filling my eyes. Thomas sighed and ran a hand through his hair. "That boy never thinks things through. He's probably sulking somewhere. He'll be back when he gets hungry." His dismissive tone made my blood boil. "This isn't sulking, Thomas. He's clearly upset." "Well, what do you expect me to do about it?" He shot back. "He's an adult. If he wants to act like a child, that's his problem." I stared at him, stunned by his indifference. "You really don't care, do you?" "Of course I care," he said, though his tone didn't match his words. "But I'm not going to chase after him. He needs to grow up and deal with his own problems." I turned away from him, trying to steady my breath, the weight of everything bearing down on me. The days that followed were agonizing. I spent every moment wondering where Ethan was, if he was safe, if he would come back. I tried calling him, but his phone went straight to voicemail. I even thought about driving around to find him, but I didn't know where to start. Thomas didn't seem to care. He went about his business like nothing had changed, leaving me to carry the weight of my worrying alone. One evening, as I sat in the living room staring at my phone, my friend Sophia called. "I haven't heard from you in a while," she said, her voice filled with concern. "Is everything okay?" I hesitated for a moment, unsure how to respond. "It's complicated," I said finally. "Complicated how?" she pressed. I ran a hand through my hair, exhaling a sigh. "Ethan left. He didn't say where he was going or when he'd be back." "Did something happen?" she asked, her tone sharp. I hesitated again, the weight of the truth pressing on me. "It's just been tense lately," I said, avoiding the full truth. Aha, Sophia said, clearly unconvinced. Well, if you need someone to talk to, you know where to find me. Thanks, I said quietly, but I wasn't sure I meant it. After hanging up, I sat for a long time, staring at the empty space where Ethan had once been. The house felt even emptier without him, and I found myself replaying our last conversation over and over. I thought about how he had looked at me, the raw vulnerability in his eyes. I thought about his question, the one I hadn't been able to answer honestly. Was it just a mistake to you? I didn't know. Maybe it was. Or maybe it was something more, something I wasn't ready to admit. All I knew was that I missed him, and that thought terrified me more than anything else. The emptiness Ethan left behind was unbearable. Days turned into weeks, and the silence in the house grew heavier with every passing moment. Thomas carried on as if nothing was wrong, burying himself in work and brushing off any mention of Ethan with a dismissive wave. He'll be fine, Thomas repeated more than once. He always is, but I wasn't fine, and I didn't know if Ethan was either. I found myself driving aimlessly some afternoons, hoping, praying that I might catch a glimpse of him walking down a street or sitting in a cafe. I checked his social media obsessively, but there was no sign of him anywhere. It was as if he had disappeared completely. I couldn't help but feel that his leaving was my fault. The note he left was short, almost casual, but the timing couldn't have been a coincidence. What did I do to him? That question haunted me, pressing down on me no matter how hard I tried to distract myself. It was a Thursday evening when I found it. Thomas had left for a dinner meeting, and I was alone in the house, aimlessly wandering from room to room. Without realizing it, I ended up in Ethan's room. The familiar scent of his cologne lingered faintly in the air. I sat on the edge of his bed, my fingers absently tracing the seams of the quilt as I tried to imagine where he might be. My eyes landed on his desk. There was a stack of papers haphazardly piled on one corner. I didn't mean to snoop, that's what I told myself, but curiosity got the better of me, and I picked up the stack, rifling through it absent-mindedly. That's when I found the letter. It wasn't addressed to me, but I knew immediately it was about me. Dear Margaret. I don't know how to say this out loud, so I'm writing it instead. I hope you never read this, but if you do, I hope it helps you understand. I can't stop thinking about you, about us, about that night. I know it was wrong, and I know it probably meant nothing to you, but to me, it meant everything. You make me feel seen, like I'm not just some failure or disappointment. You make me feel like I matter, and I don't know what to do with that. I've tried to let it go, but I can't, and I think that's why I have to leave. I'm sorry if I've made things harder for you. I never meant to, but I can't stay here anymore. Not like this. Take care of yourself, Margaret. Always, Ethan. I read the letter 3 times, and each time the weight of it sank deeper. My hands were shaking when I set it down, my mind racing with a mix of emotions I couldn't untangle. He had left because of me, because of what had happened, because of how I had handled it, or rather how I hadn't handled it. I should have felt relief. He was gone, and with him the temptation and risk. But all I felt was a deep, aching emptiness, one that threatened to swallow me whole. Thomas came home late that night, his tie loosened and the smell of whiskey clinging to his clothes. He dropped his briefcase by the door and headed straight to the kitchen, pouring himself another drink without a word. I followed him, clutching the letter in my hand. Thomas, I began, my voice trembling. He turned, looking at me with tired eyes. What is it? Margaret, I need to talk to you, I said. Tightening my grip on the letter, he sighed, setting his glass down. Can it wait? I've had a long day. I surprised myself by saying firmly, No, it can't wait, he frowned, crossing his arms over his chest. Fine. What's so important? I hesitated, the words stuck in my throat. I couldn't bring myself to tell him everything, not yet. Instead, I handed him the letter. What's this? He asked, taking it from me. Just read it, I whispered. He unfolded the letter, his eyes scanning the words. His expression changed from confusion to anger, and then to something darker. What the hell is this? He demanded, his voice low and dangerous. It's from Ethan, I whispered. No kidding, he snapped, holding up the letter. What the hell does he mean by this? What happened, Margaret? I felt the weight of his anger, his disbelief, closing in on me. Thomas, what did you do? He shouted, his voice echoing in the kitchen. I didn't mean for it to happen. I said, my tears flowing. It was a mistake, a mistake. He repeated, venom in his voice. You call that a mistake? I couldn't respond. The weight of his anger was too much to bear. Thomas left that night, slamming the door so hard it echoed through the house. I sat on the kitchen floor for hours, staring at the letter crumpled in my hands. I wanted to scream, to cry, to run away, and never look back. But I couldn't move. The next morning, I forced myself to get up,